All right, you're about to watch a film made in 1960 based on a play that debuted in 1955, based on probably the most famous American trial ever, which took place 30 years earlier in 1925. I'm pleased to share this movie with you, first of all, because it's a great mid century film with fantastic dialogue and a star studded cast, so I hope you will enjoy it. Second, and more importantly, this movie is a primary document of the Cold War. High school teachers across America have been criticized for showing Inherit the Wind to teach students about the Scopes trial, also known as the Monkey Trial, in which evolution and Christianity have this very public confrontation. The film is a dramatization of the trial, and a highly dramatic one at that, as you will see. But it's not factually accurate. That's why some people complain that widespread mental images of the Scopes trial are fallaciously determined by this movie. But here we are in the 21st century, and I think the danger that we will remember the film as the trial itself has pretty well passed. So let's think about what good this film, as a historical document, can do for us in our efforts to understand the Cold War climate of the 1950s. As a bonus, we can begin to see some continuity between the 20s and the 50s in terms of the American consciousness. First, I want to talk about the trial and then a bit about the film. After that, watch the film. In 1925, a substitute teacher in a small Tennessee town is prosecuted by the state for teaching evolutionary theory. His name is John Scopes. Now, he is indeed a criminal because Tennessee has recently outlawed the teaching of the evolution of man from lower orders of animals. So this law is on the books. It's the first one in the United States, and there will be more to come. As you probably know, this debate is actually still going on. So where does this come from? What's wrong with teaching evolution? I'll give you the short version, having to do with an American religious movement called fundamentalism. This Protestant, and by Protestant I mean loosely, Christian but not Catholic or Orthodox. This fundamentalist movement within Protestantism is based on a series of essays published in 12 volumes between 1910 and 1915, so just 10 years before the Scopes trial. They're called the Fundamentals, and they're written by authors in the conservative Protestant tradition, and then published and distributed by a pair of rich businessmen who are brothers. The essays are on topics like the virgin birth of Jesus and the resurrection of Christ after his crucifixion. But for our purposes, the important piece of the fundamentals is the idea of biblical inerrancy, that the Bible is always literally right. Now, these kinds of topics are being debated because many religious leaders in the United States are attempting to reconcile religious belief and practice with new scientific advances. Here's an example. When geologists develop theories about the age of the Earth, the numbers are in conflict with what is written in the Bible. According to a strict literal interpretation of the Bible, the Earth is somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. So scientists in the late 1800s started peering at the Earth's crust and throwing around the figure 300 million. Now the Earth is believed to be about 4.5 billion years old. So in the face of these new discoveries about the planet and in the general excitement about scientific knowledge and progress at the turn of the century, the more liberal, modernist members of the Protestant clergy try to find ways to let the words of the Bible coexist with scientific findings that contradict them. So they might offer an interpretation that the 6 days of creation in the book of Genesis are actually eras or epochs, for example. Basically, the modernists are compromisers, and the fundamentalists want to stop the compromise. The fundamentalists are in favor of return to basic biblical belief. This cartoon, published in 1922, is a great illustration of the fundamentalist position. As you can see, they believe that compromise is something of a slippery slope, or a slippery staircase in this case. It all starts by admitting the Bible is not a perfect document. The second step here is important, right? In 1922, man not made in God's image. Or in other words, if you believe that man evolved, you can't believe that he is created. Going on in this direction, making these concessions, keep going on, and you end up an atheist. Back to Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. This film will present the course of the trial in very moralistic terms, and it will be your job to understand the ideological forces at play, both in 1925 when the trial is held, and in 1960 when the film is made. Here's a picture of Scopes. He is the one on the right. The other man, George Rapplier, is a real mover and shaker in the small town where the trial will take place. He's a civic booster of sorts. He's the manager of the local coal and iron company in the background of the picture, and by training a geologist, a branch of natural science that Scopes has minored in as an undergraduate and would later pursue graduate work in. That this trial should be held in Dayton, Tennessee, a small town, is originally Raplier's idea. After the passage of the Butler Act, outlawing the teaching of evolution by the Tennessee legislature, the American Civil Liberties Union takes out newspaper advertisements in big cities in Tennessee, offering to defend any teacher who is charged with breaking this new law. They want to test the constitutionality of it on the basis of freedom of speech. That's what the Civil Liberties Union does, basically. So Raplier sees this and sets the whole thing up. He sees an ad in the newspaper. He comes up with this guy, Scopes, who is a local football coach and substitute teacher. Okay, so Raplier, you'll see, is missing from the film. So there's no indication of the intentional fabrication of the trial as, one, a publicity stunt for a small town aiming to put itself on the map, and two, as a test case for the ACLU. The two figures who are represented in the film are the lawyer Clarence Darrow, called Henry Drummond in the film, and the politician William Jennings Bryan, called Matthew Harrison Brady. Both of these figures are already famous before the trial begins, and this accounts for the intense hype surrounding the trial, which is covered nationally by reporters back when magazines and newspapers sent their own reporters out to cover events. So, Clarence Darrow is a trial lawyer and a member of the ACLU. He's famous for his sharp wit, and he's, in 1925, fresh from saving the killers Leopold and Loeb from the death penalty in Chicago. They get life in prison instead, even though they're guilty of killing a 14-year-old boy. Bryan ran for president 3 times, and he was a Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson. He is a devoutly religious prohibitionist, meaning that he's in favor of the banning of alcohol. He's beloved by the working class for advocating their interest against big money. He's called the Great Commoner. It may go against our present-day instincts to understand that Bryan, for most of his career, represents a radical wing of the Democratic Party, in spite of his religious fundamentalist beliefs. Darrow, particularly in the movie, but also in media coverage of the trial itself, represents the forces of enlightened liberal progress in scientific knowledge, while Bryan represents the backward-looking, reactionary, rural elements of the national consciousness. This will come through very clearly in the film, as will the idea that the South is mired in ignorance while the urbane North drags them kicking and screaming into the future. The reality is much more complex, of course, than the film lets on. I want to give you a few examples of this. In the movie, Darrow is booed and hissed by the townies, but in real life he was welcomed, much like Bryan, and many Dayton residents actually supported his position. So the South is not quite the island of backwardness that you see in the movie. Similarly, Bryan himself is not so much of a fool as he is made out. He actually is quite knowledgeable about evolutionary theory. But the lawyerly flourish of Darrow calling Bryan, the prosecutor for the state, to testify, that's essentially what happened. And the trial really was a media circus. Although Scopes was never thrown in jail, nor facing jail time, nor did he have an attractive girlfriend wringing her hands over him throughout, as in the movie. The way this movie is usually interpreted as a primary document of the Cold War is that it's an attack on McCarthyism, an attack on the anti-communist hysteria that has already ruined the lives of a number of liberal, social democracy-minded bureaucrats and politicians. During the post-war era, after the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States develop a very antagonistic relationship. And a senator from Wisconsin named Joe McCarthy sees in this situation an opportunity to advance his own career. So he begins this campaign to get rid of liberal politicians by naming them and outing them as having connections to communism or to communist front organizations. So at the time this movie is made in 1960, there's begun to be a backlash against this kind of rabid, illogical anti-communism. So I'd like to add to the anti-communism aspect that the promotion of science as an ideology is an important part of late 50s era thinking. This movie is made 3 years after the Soviets beat the Americans into space by launching the first satellite, called Sputnik. There's a big national push and a lot of money being spent on improving education in physics, engineering, and the hard sciences. Meanwhile, state laws banning evolutionary theory are still being enforced. The Supreme Court will rule them unconstitutional in 1968, but that's 8 years after this film comes out. So evolutionists, people who advocate the teaching of evolutionary theory, see the Sputnik crisis as an opportunity to argue that the United States is falling behind in the biological sciences as well as the physical sciences, due in part to this popular opposition to evolutionary theory based on religious sentiment and practice. And it's this popular opposition that's sort of lampooned in Inherit the Wind. So I've given you two major ways in which Inherit the Wind is a Cold War document. As you watch the film, try to notice others. Try to think of other ways that you could interpret the film as indicative of the climate of the Cold War. I'd like to end this talk with one final point about the Scopes trial and the movie that dramatizes it. You might say that over-dramatizes it. The filmmakers are really making this strong case against conservatism, especially the anti-communist element of it. But don't you find the movie itself a little dogmatic, a little heavy-handed, especially in omitting some of the subtler complications of the actual event, which I discussed earlier, the breadth of opinion that existed in both the North and the South? My feeling is that the progressive liberalism of the film itself takes on this mantle of righteous certainty, the very thing that it's complaining about. So, as one of my mentors put it, the spectrum of political ideology is not best represented by a straight line, where on one side you get more conservative and further away, and on the other side you get more liberal and further away. That's more like a horseshoe. Go too far to the left, and suddenly you're back around to the right. It's quite possible the dialogue in the 60s had hardened and polarized so much that people were becoming less tolerant of other opinions and less willing to participate in a fair and open argument like that between Darrow and Bryan at the Scopes trial. And that's the real tragedy behind Inherit the Wind, but it's still a great film.